Hi, this lesson is all about the strain that occurs where we get brittle deformation, what geologists call faults. This image you're looking at is a picture of a cliff face in Iran. It really clearly shows faulting and the effects of it. We can see if we look at this, because of the alternating light and dark layers, that there are two very distinctive breaks in the rocks here. And as a result of those breaks, the layers, the beds, have been moved, they've been displaced. This is faulting. We can see as well, because of the distinctive layers that are in here, that that block in the middle has moved down, and the two blocks either side have moved up relative to each other. Now, for us as geologists, to be able to describe what we're looking at there, and to be able to then interpret these features that we find in the rocks, we need to have some language. We need to have the terminology required to be able to communicate and understand these features. And that's what today's lesson is all about. We're working on page 6 of our Theme 13 booklets. Let's go. On page 6, you've got a diagram like this one. This is a block diagram to illustrate some of the key features of faults. Now, what I want us to do is go through this diagram, which you'll see your version has got some labels on it. But I want us to add to those labels. I'd like to annotate those labels to explain what each of these features that we find to do with faults actually are. So as I go through and explain them, I want you to be making notes in the space around your diagram. Now we're going to start by looking at a label that actually isn't on your diagram, what we call a fault plane. There are 3 of them on this diagram. The fault plane is where the break in the rock actually is. It's the surface that the rocks have moved along. All the rest of our terminology really comes back to this idea of the fault plane. It's really what defines the fault in the first place. So the fault plane, as I say, is where the rock is actually broken. The second term I want to talk about is what geologists call dip. Now we're going to talk about dip in more detail later on in this topic. But when we talk about dip, what we're talking about is the inclination of a surface. So the angle a surface is relative to horizontal. So for example, the fault plane in the middle there has a dip of 90 degrees. We always measure dip in degrees. But it's 90 degrees because it's at right angles to horizontal. The other 2 dips we can see on the left and the right are dipping at a lower angle than that, probably about 60 degrees to horizontal. The key thing we need to remember is that dip is always measured relative to the horizontal. The next term is strike. Now, strike of a fault is its orientation at the surface. And it's measured as a compass direction. We then need to think about the different sides of a fault. The first one of these we're going to talk about is what we call the footwall block. This is the block of rock below the fault plane. The way we work out whether it's a footwall block is we pick a point on the fault plane, any point on the fault plane, and the block of rock below that point is the footwall. The block of rock then above the fault plane is what we call the hanging wall. So again, we pick a point on the anywhere on the fault plane. The block of rock that's above that point is the hanging wall. As we'll see, it's really important to be able to identify those two blocks when we start looking at the different types of fault. Now, there are three types of fault that we need to be familiar with and we need to be able to recognise. The first of these, which you can see on the left, is normal faulting. Normal faulting is where we have crustal tension that pulls rocks apart. The second type of faulting we need to be able to recognise is what we call reverse faulting. Now, reverse faulting is the result of compressional stress that pushes rock together. You'll notice that both of those two types of faulting have vertical movement. The third type of faulting is strike-slip faulting. The fault in the middle is a strike-slip fault. And in a strike-slip fault, we see horizontal movement. That's a result of shear stress. Okay. Those are the key terms that we need to be able to recognise. We need to understand what they mean to help us to interpret faults. But as I said, probably the most important of these is to be able to tell the difference between a hanging wall and a footwall. This diagram at the bottom of page 6 perhaps illustrates this a little bit. So on the left we have the footwall, and on the right the hanging wall. What I'd like you to do is I'd like to annotate this diagram to suggest how we can remember this. What ways can we use to be able to tell these two parts of a fault apart? Once we can do that, we can then start to recognise the different types of fault. So we now have a whole range of terms that it's possible to use to help us to describe faults. You need to make sure that you've got good definitions of fault planes, what we mean by dip and strike, what a hanging wall and a footwall actually is. Now we need to consider how we'd actually go about recognising the difference between the different types of faults. At first glance they may look very similar, but there's actually key differences between them. And it's something for us as geologists that it's really important that we can tell a normal fault apart from a reverse fault, that we can recognise the difference between vertical movement and horizontal movement. Whether we see that from the side in a cross-sectional view, like we saw in the cliffs in the photograph at the start of this lesson, or in a much trickier way, we can start to recognise this from a bird's eye view, looking vertically down on the surface, which is what we'd see on a geological map. Now we're going to get into geological maps in theme 14. But for now, it's really important that we have a really secure understanding of these different terms, because what we need to do next is we need to apply those to understanding the different types of faults. But that's for another lesson. I'll see you then.